Okay, starting the event. I think we've started.
Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the club webinar around return to play. I'm hoping that everybody can hear us, and we're going to spend about an hour or so just talking through some points around the return to play documents that we've produced, and then there'll be an opportunity for everybody to ask some questions. We've got a number of questions that have come out through the Padlet system, which you've hopefully been able to contribute to. So for those who don't know me, I'm Sue Story, Chief Executive of Volleyball England. On the presenter list tonight, we have Rob Payne, Gillian Harrison, Sam Jameson, Jonathan Moore from the Hub team, and James Murphy as competitions lead, and also Brendan Fogarty, who we are desperately trying to get into the presenter bit at the moment to be able to present from the board perspective and his speciality around risk assessment. So in terms of the process, I'll just hand you over to Rob, who's going to talk you through how this will work this evening.
Okay, hello everybody. Just going through the webinar protocol. So everybody's microphones will be muted as it's a live event, and unfortunately we won't be able to see anybody's webcams. However, when we stop presenting, hopefully everybody will be able to see us, the panel that will be able to field and answer questions. As Sue mentioned, there is a Padlet link which hopefully people have seen. We've seen lots of questions coming in, which has allowed us to have some time to prepare and think about the questions that you've asked. Lots of really great ones coming through. Also on the right hand side of your screen, there is a live Q&A where you can ask questions through that medium instead of Padlet. Something also to be aware of is there is a 20-second delay from us speaking. So when you type your questions, it might take that period of time to think about them and answer them. Right, so going through. In terms of the agenda today, Sue and I have just done the welcome and introduction. James is going to follow with some general principles about return to play, then go into some specific guidance around volleyball, beach volleyball and grass volleyball played on the grass, and then go into some sort of risk assessments of how you as clubs can risk assess your activity when you go back to delivering club activity. And then finally, we'll be able to answer some more specific questions that might have arisen in your area with some Q&A. Right, so over to James.
I think it's me next. Sorry, Rob.
Oh,
I was just going to do some, just very broadly talk about the process as part of the introduction that we've had to go through to get to where we are today, which I think is useful as a sort of background for everyone. So as you're aware, a few weeks ago, government said that sports can return, and the way that they would do that is once the government had checked that the NGB's plans were in line with government guidance. So we had to then quickly do an awful lot of work to pull together a set of plans that could be approved by government to enable us to follow this process of return to play. We pulled together a return to volleyball working group with a range of people from across the community who've been incredibly helpful in helping us to pull together all of this information. And as part of this, what we said is, we said there's actually 4 sports that we needed to, or 4 disciplines that we needed to look at, which I know you're all thinking that's not quite right, but for the purposes of this, we felt that outdoor volleyball at this time of year and with everything that's going on right now was something that's very different from indoor volleyball. So outdoor 6v6, indoor 6v6, beach volleyball and sitting were the 4 sort of disciplines that we decided to pull plans together for. The first one that we put in, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, was the beach volleyball plans, because we were very conscious we're right in the middle of the beach season and we wanted to get 2v2 beach up and running as quickly as we possibly could. We pulled together the plans. We've also done a lot of work around the sort of scientific analysis of how often people come into contact with each other. And there's a study that was done in Italy around beach volleyball where they reviewed a 48-minute game, and they found that 2v2 players came into contact of face-to-face, less than a metre, for around 1 minute and 42 seconds. Sorry, 1 minute and 45 seconds. So the government guidance is that you need to be more concerned if you're face-to-face for more than 15 minutes. So quite clearly, 1 minute and 45 seconds gave us a really good indication that the level of risk was lower. So we were able to use that evidence to help us with the plans for beach. We did a similar exercise. One of the guys in the team has done as an exercise ourselves, looking at indoor volleyball, where we reviewed the cup finals and looked at a 5-set game, and that came out as 4 minutes and 33 seconds for the amount of time people were face to face in a 5-set game. So broadly speaking, we were fairly confident that it was 1 minute per set, roughly speaking, which gave us a level of confidence that we were able to push through some plans and be confident that we're not putting the community at a level of risk. So I'm really pleased with the amount of work that we did on that. We submitted those plans for beach, for indoor and for outdoor. I'll come to sitting shortly. I'm delighted to say that we were one of the first team sports to get the green light from government to allow us to go ahead and start our return to play plans. I know James is going to talk about it shortly, but this is one step on a fairly long agenda of how you get to be able to actually play. So government guidance, our guidance, venue guidance, club guidance. There's an awful lot of information that I know clubs are having to go through to get themselves ready to play again. So just very quickly to talk about sitting, we haven't yet been able to submit the plans to government for return to sitting. There's essentially 3 reasons for that. The first one is there is a level of risk of formite transmission of the floor, because essentially the floor is part of the equipment and there's a risk of transferring the virus over the floor. So we needed to look very carefully at how we mitigate that risk. There's also a much higher level of face-to-face contact. So closeness at the net is also an issue in sitting, because they stay in the positions close to the net for longer periods of time. And of course, certain members of the sitting community will have levels of vulnerability that we also need to make sure that we protect those people and mitigate the risks as much as we can. So taking on board that, we've set up a group that's looking at sitting. They are still looking at solutions as to how we can mitigate these risks. One of the things that they're looking at is around some sort of protective barrier that could go over the net that's see-through, yet stops spreading of droplets through the net. So as you can see, a lot of work going on this. Sport England are really supportive of what we're doing with sitting, because they're as keen as we are to try and get the sitting community up and running as quickly as possible. But I think from my point of view, massive thanks to everybody who's been involved. We've done a lot of work on all 4 sets of plans, and really pleased with the speed that we got our plans agreed through the government process. I think that's all I needed to say. I think the only other thing to say today is really about those plans for return to play. It's not specific about the competitions that's going to take place. So with that, I'll hand you over to James, who's going to talk through the general principles.
Thanks very much, Sue. I'm not going to bore you too much by going through in detail each of these guidances. They're all published out there. There'll be links that follow this, so you can read them to your heart's content. Essentially, the advice is in this sequence. First of all, look at government guidance, make sure that we're still allowed to play, there's no local lockdown in process, etc. Follow all of the guidance about social distancing whenever you can, and think about, if you're thinking about mask wearing or face covering wearing, all of that sort of guidance is available from the government. The next thing you have to take into consideration is the venue guidance. The venue will have been thinking very hard about how they can return to sport, how they can let you enter and exit the venue in a safe way. They'll be thinking about things like, are they going to provide water or not? They'll be thinking about first aid, and all of those things will be an important part of your risk assessment. The next thing that you have to follow is the Volleyball England guidance. We've tried to make it as generic as possible so that it brings the risk down to as low as reasonably acceptable. And I'm sure there'll be questions more about that later, and we'll be happy to answer them. But essentially, on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the Volleyball England guidance. And then finally, the most important thing is you as a club have to go through and do your own risk assessment and think about what mitigations that you need to put in place to ensure that your members feel safe as they come back into the sport. Next slide, Rob. Thanks. So what I've tried to do here, and I really want to stress, this is mainly the items that are volleyball specific. So please don't read this and think this is all you need to do. You absolutely have to go back and think about the government guidance, the venue guidance, and all the other things that are out there. So the areas that we broke it down into, so basically prior to volleyball activity, nothing special from a volleyball perspective, just government and venue guidance. In terms of the organizer and the venue, the two key things is it's important that you get the volleyballs cleaned according to manufacturer's instructions. And I know we've got a question about that later. The next thing is that it's important that you get your players to opt in. So when you've gone through all of the processes to do the risk assessments, you've followed all of the guidance, your players need to have gone through, understood all of that, and they need to accept the residual risk and opt in to accept that they want to play with those risks in place. And that's very, very important. The one thing that's not volleyball specific is this idea of a COVID officer, but it is so important that I brought it out on this slide. It's really important for every single event, basically every single court, that you have a COVID officer. And their responsibility is essentially to make sure that you are following all of the guidance and help people to understand what that guidance is and stay informed of that as it changes to make sure that you keep everybody safe. The next thing that we talk about is the 30 people maximum, and I'm sure there's questions about that. So one of the things that we want to get across to people is when we talk about 30 people maximum, we talk about 30 people maximum per field of play, per independent field of play. So if you imagine you're in a big field somewhere and you've got 4 independent fields of play in the 4 corners of the field, then you could have 120 people there. You would need a COVID officer for each of them, but there's no reason for you not to do that. Now, I'm sure people will ask later, how close can they be together? Well, that's down to you to do your own risk assessment and work out what you think is safe. The other key thing for every event is you need to, for 21 days, keep a record of all of the people that are attending, so that if there is any instances where you need to use track and trace, then you can provide those names to the track and trace service. For training activity, you need to design all of your training activity to design any face-to-face activities that are longer than 3 seconds in duration. If they're less than 3 seconds in duration, that's fine. But you know, take an example where you're doing a blocking hitting drill and you say both of you stand at the net at the start, and then the ball gets thrown over the net, passed to the setter, and the setter sits it out to the hitter. That's a bad drill. Don't do it, because they'll be face to face for longer than 3 seconds. Okay. We would ask that you minimize shouting. Shouting is a great way of spraying droplets, and therefore if you can minimize shouting, that's a great thing to do. And then finally, you need to have a break every 20 minutes. Again, that's government guidance. 20 minutes is the maximum that you should be working, and then you need to stop, sanitize. So that's the hands and wiping the ball down. During competitive match play, or even if you're just doing a training game, then you should do no congratulations, so no high fives, minimize the contact, maximize the social distancing. Whenever you get to the 15 points in any set, you will stop, sanitize, so there'll be a 60-second timeout called by the ref effectively to do that sanitizing. And again, make sure the balls and hands are sanitized between each set. Keep the officials to a minimum. So for instance, in the NVL, we won't have line judges this year, just to minimize the number of people on the field of play. Don't use any kind of mouth blown whistle. Look to find an electronic whistle or any other noisemaker that's not requiring mouth blowing. And again, for people like scorers and coaches, bring your own pens, so we're not sharing any equipment that we don't need to. So again, we can minimize the fomite transmission. And quite importantly, like many other sports, the referee has the power to sanction appropriately for anything that they consider is a unnecessary COVID risk. After volleyball activity, again, just follow the venue and government guidance. Just a few things on children's activity. The 30 limit needs to include any safeguarding requirements. So if you need chaperones, they have to be included in that 30. So that reduces the number of participants, obviously. And the guidance is parents, please, use a safe drop-off procedure. So not everybody arriving at the same time. And if possible, don't spectate. And if you do spectate, make sure you're outside the field of play. And then finally, as I said earlier, additional advice for whoever's organising it, you will need to do your own risk assessment and your own risk mitigation plan to make sure that any specific requirements for your club, your venue, and your use of that venue are thought through and bring the risk down to the most reasonably acceptable level.
Perfect. Thank you, James. That's brilliant. Is this one yours as well?
Yeah. So what they were the specific things that are in the guidance that we've published. I just wanted to now just get you to think about some of the things that might apply. So obviously follow all of the general principles and guidance above. So the next thing you'll need to do, so once you've understood all those things, you'll need to get hold of the venue guidance and or risk assessment, because that's going to be an important step in your journey to do the next step, which is to carry out your own risk assessment. And hopefully Brendan or somebody or me will talk later about the risk assessment process. But just some ideas here about some things to think about when you think about your own risk assessment. So the first thing is team benches and end switches. Do you need to do that? Can you stay on one side of the net? Or are you going to have to move the benches to reduce the fomite risk? Are you going to put the benches on the other side of the court? So again, there's separation. Just have to think those things through. Substitutions. How will you do substitutions differently to enable there to be the maximum separation between social distancing whilst you're doing those substitutions? Score sheets. For instance, in the NVL, we're going to say that the captains don't need to sign the score sheets at the end of the match to reduce the number of times that they are touched. Think about who should be wearing face coverings, who needs to do that. So that could be anything from, you might choose for everybody to do it. In America, there are a number of states that have mandated the use of face masks even whilst playing. We're not mandating that. That's not a requirement for us. But if that's what it takes to bring your club together, then maybe that's what you choose to do. Think about things like, in matches, normally players stand in the corner to warm up. They need to have extra room to enable them to maintain their socially distancing. Similarly, things like timeouts. If you call a timeout, normally everybody has to huddle together to get off court. Again, think about, would you allow players to stay on the court just to ensure that they can do their socially distance at that point during timeouts. And then finally, the conversation about lineup sheets. Again, another potential fomite transmission route. What would you do with those? How would you make sure that they're done? Now, you might be saying, well, why don't you tell us the answers to all of these? And to a degree, we will. We'll publish some guidance around these things. But as I said before, it's really important that you think about the risks that you're prepared to accept in your environment with your teams, So you need to think about each of those and what the right answer. And then finally, those 3 dots at the end are to say, this isn't an exhaustive list. You need to think about your particular circumstances and think about the particular risks that you might be running and how you might mitigate those risks.
Perfect. Thank you, James. Right, now this next bit was going to be Brendan Fogarty talking to us about risk assessment. He has done an awful lot of work on developing some template risk assessments, which you'll have seen we've shared some of the information on this. Unfortunately, Brendan, I don't think has been able to get onto this part of the call, and we're not entirely sure why. We're having some Wi-Fi problems, but so James, I wonder, would you be able to just talk us through the risk assessment document, and then anyone from the team, if you want to add in anything to this part as well. Is that okay, James?
Yeah, no, they're happy to do that.
Thank you.
So despite the scary looking number of slides here, you'll be glad to know we're going to whip through them pretty quickly. So this is just really the content slide. So if we can go on to the next slide. So again, we've talked about a lot of these things. So the key thing here is that you do need to do the risk assessments and thinking about the risks associated with the virus. So if we go on to the next one. So first of all, there are 3 key risks associated with the virus that you need to cover. So the first one is droplet transmission. And also in there is also the aerosol transmission. So and they're very tightly linked, but they're slightly different. So first of all, the droplet transition. So that's when you exhale, there are droplets, which are the ones that are greater than 5 microns. When you expel them, they contain particles. They don't tend to travel beyond the 6 feet, and hence why the 2 meter distancing is so important. And you need to think about, that's why we do this no face-to-face. This is why we do, if we do face-to-face, we minimize the time that's being done. The aerosol piece is slightly different. They don't tend to fall to the ground, and they are going to be in the air throughout the entire thing. And that's why outdoor is less risky than indoor, why having good airflow within a venue, having the doors open or the air conditioning working hard in a venue are all good things to do, because that recycles the air and gets rid of any aerosol transmission risk. Then the foam mite transition risk is all about how, if you touch a surface and that surface has virus on it, then it reaches onto your hand. And then the risk path is from hand to nose, mouth or eyes. And it's really important to understand that just because a surface has a virus on it, it's not the end of the world. The end of the world is if there's enough virus there, it gets onto your hands and then gets into your eyes, nose and mouth. So the key thing to think about to mitigate the foam mite risk is all about hand sanitizing. That's why we have the 20-minute break in training, and why we have the 15 points timeout, and why we're wiping the ball down. It's all to minimize that foam mite risk. And again, think about, we talked about team benches earlier. That's about foam mite risk, and therefore you need to put in controls around that. We talked about the score sheets. That's another foam mite risk. So any surface is essentially a foam mite risk. So the minimizing that we can do there is really important. And then finally, the last thing is the population. It's thinking about the risk factors associating with those participants and any underlying health conditions or high risk groups who wish to participate, and what mitigations that you put in place to protect that population. Next slide. Okay, again, I'm not going to go through this in huge detail. It is already published on the VE website. We talk about the various risks, and you can see them here, and you can see how we came up with it and why we think we've been able to minimize that risk. Okay, next one. Yeah, so participation. So again, we looked at the various kind of factors around here and came up with numbers which made playing possible, but minimize the risk that we would have. So for instance, the 30 people, that equates to a scorer, a first referee, a second referee, plus 13 people aside, and one spare. So that means that we can play a match sensibly. It would require in that sort of numbers that you would socially distance if you were off court. So you need to think about how you do that. Spectators, again, we would want them outside of the field of play and socially distance using the venue guidance. We are saying at the NVL level that no line judges are required. We would probably recommend that to local league sides, but again, it's your call. You might be playing in a situation where those people would have been there anyway and you don't see it as a particular risk. Your call. We've said about the whistles already, and we talked about the ball cleaning before. Next slide. Obviously, self-isolation, this is about the kind of the beforehand and how we fit into it. So, we're just following the government's guidance here for self-isolation. The key thing, though, and again, can't stress this enough, is you need to protect your teammates and your opposition. So don't be a hero. If you're feeling under the weather, if you're not sure, don't attend. Make sure you look after everybody else. I'd hate for us, for volleyball, to be the thing that shut sport down because we weren't being careful enough about following these sort of self-isolation things. We'll go on to talk about what happens if somebody becomes ill next. So next slide. Oh, we don't talk about it on the next slide. Okay, so I'll answer that question now. So the key thing is that if people become ill after a training session, then clearly what they need to do is they need to get tested. Again, following the government guidelines, if you're ill, get tested. You will be contacted by track and trace if you're positive. And if you're contacted, then you need to give the name of the individual who's tracked the people who attended the sessions that you've been in based on the questions that the test and trace people ask. You can then give them those names and then they will be contacted appropriately. Again, traveling, you need to follow the government guidance. Can't say more than that. The hand washing, as I said earlier, is absolutely critical before you start, during the training session and after it. Again, normal guidance, all the sports are doing the same thing around changing room and showers. Where you can, turn up dressed and ready to play. Where you can, shower at home to minimize the amount of time that you're in those close contact situations. Next slide. So we've said before, track and trace, make sure that you record for 21 days in whatever way is manageable for your club to assist the NHS test and trace if required. Make sure that you avoid close contact wherever you can. Yeah, so, when you turn up and you're chatting before, make sure you keep your 2 meters. When you do the timeouts, do your 2 meters. When you're chatting to the coach, make sure you keep the 2 meters. Wherever you can, it's really important to do that because that stops the droplet transmission risk. And then, as we've said, players and coaches need to have a copy of that risk assessment and any agreements that are made, and make sure that they're agreed with the sports centre and local authorities so that everybody's aware of what those requirements are. Next slide. So just want to talk to you a little bit about this because this is quite key when you're doing your own risk assessments. So if you can see on the left hand side what we've tried to do at the top, let's cover that first. So first of all, we've come up with a score and we've categorized that as low, medium and high. And the way you get to that score, it's likelihood times severity equals the overall risk number. So if we think it's a low risk and a medium severity, as we did here, then we ended up with the 12, which puts it into the high category. So on the left-hand side, we talk about the hazard, we talk about who's effective and what the original risk is. On the right-hand side, we talk about, so what control measures are we going to put in place to reduce that risk? And then once we've put all those controls in place, we do a reassessment of the residual risk, and then we come up with our now lowered risk. This is subjective, it's not scientific, but it is a very, very good way and an industry standard way of dealing with risk. Next slide. So this is an example for droplet transmission, and again, I'm not going to go through this. It's on the website. You can go and have a look at this at your leisure. And yeah, so this is another one. So again, I won't go through this one. It's on there. Yeah, and then so what are the general principles around risk? So first of all, the first thing is risk avoided is the best way of dealing with it. So don't allow the situation to occur in the first place. Once you've identified that there is a risk that you can't avoid completely, then you then need to evaluate the risks to work out how high they are. And then what you do is to take actions to reduce the risks as low as reasonably practical. Again, another industry standard term. And then finally, and this is really, really key, ensure everyone involved in the activity reads and understands that risk assessment, because essentially that's what protects you from people suing you later. If they've understood the risk assessment, they've understood what the risks are, and they've accepted that they still want to opt in and play, understanding the risks, then that's the greatest protection you can have later for people coming along and saying, I was playing, but I didn't understand the risk. Well, you saw the risk assessment, you agreed to the risk assessment, and you opted in. Okay. Is that the last slide? No, that's this slide. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, so this is just an opportunity. Thank you, James. An opportunity to explain to everybody the membership offer for this year for our clubs, coaches, and referees. As you've probably been made aware, the 31st of July was the last day of the 1920 season, and therefore membership is up for renewal. And here's just a few of the, I guess, benefits of renewing your membership with Volleyball England this year. I guess top of the list, especially in the times that we're in, is around insurance. And we've got a few COVID-related questions to insurance, which we'll address a bit later. But the club insurance especially does cover directors and officers, and that be you as the committee members, as well as your players and volunteers. And then going down to the Volleyball England support, we have got a dedicated team of staff that are happy and willing to support with all the issues and all the development areas that you might be looking to face as a club, whether that be around your governance, your finances, any sort of development planning, safeguarding, and so on. So if you've got any of those questions, if you need any support, we are here to help, and we're more than willing to give some one-to-one guidance and support in those areas. Right, so I think we're on to the question and answers. So if I stop sharing, I'm not sure if anybody can now see the videos of us. Right. So we'll start with a different voice rather than James. We'll start with Sam for the first question. So will COVID-19 be covered under the standard Volleyball England insurance? Will clubs need to create legal waivers for players, coaches and parents concerning COVID-19?
Cool, thank you, Rob. Yeah, good question. And I think there's been a few kind of similar questions on insurance that have come in. I guess the bottom line is that infectious diseases such as COVID are not directly covered through an insurance policy. Everything that James has just kind of taken us through is all around obviously the risk minimization and then how we manage that residual risk. And that's essentially where the insurance protection comes in for us. So this is really about us trying to protect our people and minimise any danger or any risk that we could be putting people into. What we're looking for here is obviously to have those risk assessments in place, to make sure that all of the members that are taking part have seen those risk assessments and formally opted in. Obviously, nobody is under any, nobody's obviously going to be forced to play volleyball if they're not comfortable with the risk assessment. So it is a voluntary thing. And from there on, our insurers essentially they will be there to advise and support clubs, affiliated clubs that are following this guidance. But it's really important that the guidance is followed and it is implemented, and that's where that protection and that advice will come in from then on. So it's a relatively brief and straightforward answer. I hope that answers the question that's on people's minds, but I'm sure there'll be more that will come in. Rob will direct them through. We'll answer anything that we can on that. But I think that I guess the thing to appreciate from a practical perspective is someone contracting an infectious disease of this nature, it's virtually impossible to pinpoint where that would have happened. So for a claim to be brought and for a case to be enacted would be incredibly difficult, is the bottom line.
Thank you, Sam. Moving on to the next question. So somebody has asked around the COVID officer role and suggested that it's a challenge to try and get volunteers for roles like that. So they were wondering whether a player or a coach or somebody participating in a session would be able to be that designated person to undertake the role. James, are you willing to answer that one?
Yep, I'm happy to answer that one. So I will say for my club, I'm the COVID officer, and I'm both a player and a coach for that team. Essentially, the requirement is that you have to understand all of the guidance and the risk assessments, and then you have to help your players follow it. And for me, it's relatively straightforward. A quick chat at the beginning of the session, socially distanced, obviously, to get everybody on board with what the changes are. And then for a training session, my watch beeps every 20 minutes, and we all stop and sanitize, and then we get back to our training session. So it isn't particularly onerous, as long as you've done the risk assessments, everybody shared, everybody understands what they need to do. It's just, occasionally people start to gather to have a chat, and you have to remind them that they need to separate again. So yes, it can definitely be a player or a coach or basically any individual involved in that session.
Thank you, James. I think on risk assessments, we're getting loads of questions through, so we might be best to go with a quick fire sort of question and answer. A lot of them are fairly fast answers, I think. So are you willing to do a quick fire question and answer, James?
I will do my best.
Okay, so do we ask juniors to opt in to risk assessments as well?
So the answer is yes-ish. It's the parents that actually have to opt in, not the juniors.
Okay, perfect. Another one was around the risk assessments being published as PDFs. Can we share them as Word documents that people can edit?
I think the answer is yes, but you can answer that one because you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine.
Yeah,
the next one was around the risk assessments and whether that should be done holistically by the club, or does it need to be done by each individual team that might be in a different setting or environment?
So again, best practice would be that everybody would be involved in that risk assessment, because the more people that are involved in it, the more different risks that you come up with, and also the better buy-in that you get from the individuals to follow the mitigations that come up with, because they were involved in creating them. So that's best practice. In practice, I recognise that doesn't always happen, but that's best practice.
And then following on around signatures, so would you expect people to sign something to say that they agree with those risk assessments, or is it a verbal opt-in, or what's the practice that you would look to follow?
So again, it's pretty much down to yourselves. Think about what we've just talked about, though. If you don't have a signature on a piece of paper, then if you get sued, it's one person's word against another. If you have a signed piece of paper, then that protects you more. So, I can only say that.
Okay, great. The next one, I've got some feedback there. Did everybody else hear that? Okay, so can we adopt the Volleyball England risk assessment for our club and use it for our own?
So if I understand the question correctly, you can certainly use the Volleyball England risk assessment as a starting point for yours. But what you need to do is look at the particular circumstances for your individual. So if I take the national squads, they're going to be playing at or training at Kettering. They have to take the base risk assessment that we've presented, and then they have to add in all of the venue specific and all of the team specific stuff that's appropriate. So it's only a base. You can't just say, here's my risk assessment, it's the one Volleyball England published. That's not enough. You have to do your own part to it. Okay,
questions are still coming in. So in the risk assessment, what does the L, S and R in the risk and residual risk columns stand for? And what are they scored out of 10, or what's the maximum score that they could be scored out of?
So again, as I said before, you actually have to kind of look. Can you just bring that page back up again so I can make sure I'm saying the right thing?
Yeah, just let me.
Yeah,
you see that?
Back, it tells you on the first page. So L is likelihood, S is severity, and R is the resultant risk. So it's how likely is it to occur, how severe is the impact if it does occur, and likelihood times severity gives you the overall risk.
Perfect.
And my understanding is that those are a 1 to 5 score.
Okay. We'll go on to some less risk assessment related questions. Somebody's asked why the need for an electronic whistle.
Okay, so basically, when you blow into a whistle, you create a concentrated stream of droplets, which is therefore a high transmission risk and a very bad thing to do. So that's why we want electronic whistles. And again, you know, there's two different parts of this, right? So you have to think about what the circumstance is. If you're a bunch of mates playing and you decide to use a bicycle bell as your whistle, then fine, go ahead and do that. We're not mandating electronic whistles. We're just saying don't use a mouth blown whistle because you're creating that extra risk.
Just going back to,
sorry, I was just going to say, and I think that's consistent with what other sports are doing as well. So we've been in contact with all the other sports, and pretty much everybody is saying don't use blown whistles because of that reason. So we are consistent with other sports.
And somebody's asked for clarification, Sam. So around the insurance question, the answer is transmission of the disease is not covered. Is that correct?
Yes, in a nutshell, it's not covered. For clarity.
Okay, we'll go to some of the earlier questions that were on the Padlet forum now then. So the first one was around people diving on an indoor court and leaving sweat on the surface. So what is the best advice to be given around that scenario?
So as with all of these things, as you think about risk, having a wet floor, that's a big risk because people can slip, and so you need to deal with that immediate risk. So you need to wipe up the floor, and then the person who's done the wiping would then need to sanitize their hands, because what you're trying to do in that case is the fomite risk. So just as you would do in a normal game, if you need to bring a mopper on to clean a wet spot, you do so. The only difference now is that whoever did that mopping needs to sanitize their hands before going back to play.
Great. And then following on from that around sanitizing, so we've had a few questions around cleaning the volleyballs and the manufacturer's guidance, and there's been a bit of a need for people to get a bit more clarification in those areas.
Yeah, so this obviously is a very difficult one because whenever you clean a ball, one of the manufacturers, I can't remember it is, I think Molten is admitted basically if you use harsh chemicals on the ball, you will damage the ball. So all we can do from a Volleyball England perspective is say, follow the manufacturer's guidance when you're cleaning the ball. As an individual club, you might be thinking and saying, okay, well, we've got this slightly older ball and we're really worried about the risk, so we'll use that older ball and recognise that probably halfway through the season or by the end of that season, we're going to have to throw that ball away. So again, you just have to work your way through that.
Yeah, it was Macassar that had said no chemicals or liquids, but as you say, James, we've got to deal with the risks almost in order, and the first one is the transmission risk, so therefore we need to wipe down the balls.
Okay, thank you. We've had another question around the COVID officer's role, asking for some clarification on all the things that they should be responsible for. And we've done some research, and we will publish a role description that people can use and adopt and have as sort of a framework to guide people into that role that clearly wouldn't have that role this time last year. Moving on then, so around indoor sports all areas, there's quite a few questions that have come in around people that have got sports halls that cover more than one court. And they were just asking questions around whether that means that they can have multiple teams and larger numbers than the recommended 30 in that area.
So what we've said is that you have to think about it as independent fields of play. So again, it's a lot to do with risk assessment. So if you've got a sports hall which has got 4 doors, so you can have separate entrances and exits to each of those fields of play, if there's a sufficient gap between the courts, then the answer is yes, assuming your risk assessment agrees with that idea. If you're in a situation whereby to get to the second court, everybody has to trample in and out of the first court, then you'd have to think about what extra mitigations you would put in before you would allow that to occur. So our guidance is about per field of play, independent field of play. If you have anything different, then you have to think about what mitigations you would put in place to make sure that you were still safe to operate.
Great. Sue, we'll move on to a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. There's been a couple of questions around people's venues and facilities. And people are saying that they're really struggling to access facilities. Leisure centres are converting their sports halls into gyms, and schools are currently closed down into September, and they've got no sort of future idea of whether they're going to open up again. So what are Volleyball England going to do to support clubs in that situation?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I mean, this is a huge problem for all indoor sports. We're working closely with Sport England and the other indoor sports to try and lobby government to say that this is happening at loads of leisure centres across the country where they've redesignated the sports hall to hold gym equipment or spin classes or whatever it is, so they can space people out, and that's creating a huge problem for availability on courts. We're doing our best to lobby government. There's a meeting taking place next week with all the sports to try and put pressure as to how we can try and resolve this. We haven't got a simple answer to this one, because unfortunately leisure centres make their own decisions as to how they're going to run their facilities and where they feel that their income is going to come from. And so they're making that choice to protect the gym and the classes and so on. We're also aware of the issues around schools, and schools are either not wanting to have external groups coming into the schools because that's bringing in a level of risk, or that they're using they've also repurposed their facilities for classrooms or for other things. So again, we're putting pressure on government to say, well, you've opened up sport and now we're faced with this challenge of not being able to get the facilities. Haven't got an easy answer, but we're certainly banging that drum as hard as we can to try and put pressure on to get those facilities back.
Thank you. Other question that's come in is around referees and whether they're going to be provided any guidance or guidelines around their role. And the answer is yes. We actually have another webinar planned next week, next Tuesday at 7 p.m. for match officials. So Nick Heckford, the lead of the officials working group, will be delivering that webinar. So the referees out there, there's an opportunity, and we're planning to do the same for coaches as well, to provide some guidance around practices and applying the what we're talking about today into a coaching setting specifically. So we'll move on around questions around competition. So National Volleyball League, we've had a few questions asking when that is likely to start and if there's going to be any changes to rules or regulations.
I'll take that one. So as you're aware, we've currently been doing a number of consultations to understand what the clubs feel and where they're at. As we've already just discussed, one of the biggest issues is understanding when halls are going to be available. From the surveys that we've got back received so far, the vast majority have said that they would have a good chance of being back by the end of September. So that's kind of our current planning assumption, but at the end of September that teams would be able to start being indoor again. And therefore our current planning assumption, and this is subject to the rest of the consultation coming in and conversations with the board, etc., but our current best planning assumption is that the month of October would effectively be indoor training for teams to get ready back for start of competition at the end of October, beginning of November. So that's our current planning assumption.
Thanks, James. And there's been questions around if people are unable to fulfill fixtures due to people that might have COVID symptoms. Are there scenarios where the league will, I guess, deal with those situations and sympathise and take the right measures? Yeah.
So so there's a number of things kind of related to this. So let me see if I can answer several of these in the same question. So so the first thing is, as we're planning the calendar, we are aiming to create at least a couple of weekends so that if for any reason a match can't be played on its scheduled date, those dates will be left free in the calendar and teams will be able to move those unplayed fixtures into the gap in the calendar. That's part of our planning process. We've also said that we need a percentage of fixtures to be played to enable us to declare the season complete and for promotion and relegation to occur. If we don't have enough fixtures played, I should say, if there's even after those extra weekends, if matches can't be played, we've decided that we'll do the same as we did this year, which is the points that we've split between the teams, and that will allow us to complete the season. If it's even worse than that, and we don't even have enough matches played to complete the league, then we will fall back to our next worst case scenario, which is, unfortunately, we won't be able to have any promotion and relegation. So they're the various fallbacks. So extra weeks to fit it in, divide the points if we still can't get it played, and then finally, if we can't get enough matches played to have a reasonable thing, then we'll do that, and that will all be published as part of the NVR regulations.
Thank you, James. We've got a few sort of more training and recreational questions that have just come in. So for a university that hosts their own teams, is there a requirement that they would sanitize and clean the court after each team? So when one team finishes and the other one starts, what would you advise around that?
Sorry, was that court cleaning?
Yeah, so when one team finishes and the next team starts, how would you deal with that situation?
So essentially, you need to do your own risk mitigation and determine whether that's required or not. If you think we are not requiring teams to clean courts before training sessions or before matches, we are letting the venues determine what they think is the right cleaning pattern for floors. Remember, the real risk for floors and other equipment is not the fact that they may have virus on it, but the fact that you touch that surface with your hand and then go on to touch your nose, mouth or eyes after you've touched that surface. So as long as you're doing regular hand sanitizing, you can significantly reduce the risk of catching the virus through that mechanism.
Great, thank you. And then with regards to recreational play, so we've obviously got rules or guidelines in place around matches and competition as such, but how do you manage the face-to-face contact and level exposure in a more recreational setting? Would you put any specific measures in place or advise them?
So for recreational play, again, obviously it depends on the circumstances. Just think about numerous things. So imagine you're outdoors in the park. The transmission risk outdoors is very low because sunlight kills it. It doesn't last long outside. The wind, even a gentle breeze, will disperse both the aerosol and the droplets very, very quickly. So you're in a particularly low risk situation. However, what we're trying to do is minimize the risk. So even in that scenario, you would make sure that if you've got, I don't know, 14 people there, you would make sure that the ones that aren't on court, the two that aren't on court, remain socially distanced. And again, just think about, you know, any time where you're in a situation where you're face to face, you know, think about serving. If people are at the net, and there's another player at the other side, think, well, actually, maybe we just take each of us take one step away from the net to minimize that potential risk. So it's all about thinking about what's a sensible adaptation that would just mitigate that risk as you go through.
Right. In terms of questions, we've still got a few more coming in. As the panel, are we happy to carry on with a few more, or shall we finish up after the hour?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. If
got
people
some
are
nodding
happy
heads.
to.
Right, so what are the plans to complete the Junior National Cup finals that are not played in April?
Yeah, Jonathan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can do. So far, we've said that these matches can be completed with one of the teams being the home venue or taking on responsibilities to be the home venue. They won't be hosted centrally, with the exception of potentially the under 15 last states working that through to a final. But we just haven't been able to work out the particulars of that yet and where that would fit in our calendar going forwards.
Thank you. Moving on to masks. So there's been a few questions that have come in around masks and use of masks during training and matches. So is there any evidence that supports that wearing them would reduce risk, and would we advise masks being used?
So, and I'll tie this in. I think a few people have asked this. So, when we publish our guidance, we are publishing it for everybody playing volleyball in England. And therefore, that's why we kept it as generic as we've had. And some people are asking, is there going to be NVL guidance? The answer is absolutely. Not only will there be referee guidance, there will be an addendum to the NVL regulations, which will cover the changes that we're going to make to those regulations. So, for instance, in the NVL regulations, we will say that the requirement to use paddles will be removed. Somebody asked about technical timeouts. Yes, we're going to remove technical timeouts so that the additional timeout for the COVID sanitisation, it'd be pointless to have one at 15 and one at 16. So clearly those technical timeouts will disappear. So there will be additional guidance that are published around that. Now, as to masks, I think everybody is aware that masks have been, throughout the entire pandemic, have been troublesome in terms of the advice to wear or not to wear. Certainly at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK, there was no strong evidence for wearing of it. There was a belief that it could harm as much as it helped, because people aren't used to and don't know how to wear masks. Therefore, if they do pick up virus, then when they take them off, then potentially they touch, and they're not clear on the benefits. If the mask gets wet, then its effectiveness drops dramatically, etc., etc., etc. So in terms of the face covering conversation, we have not in our guidance, because we were able to get to the low risk category without the requirement to have masks. We have not made that mandatory across all of volleyball games. At the NVL level, we are going to ask our officials to wear masks wherever practical. We're also likely, and we're still finalising this debate, but we're likely to ask bench personnel to do so as well, again, wherever possible, because it's another simple step that enables it. And because now people have to wear face coverings indoors, in shops and other locations, people are starting to become more familiar with that process, and we see it as a sensible step to do it. But we are not requiring people to wear masks when on court.
Thank you. In terms of the research that has been done around face-to-face contact and the research that we reference in the guidelines, when applying that into a sort of training session, does that equate to the amount of time that's being allowed to be the duration of that session? So whether that be recreational activity or a training session, is there a maximum limit in which we would advise that to last?
Yeah, so I think that there's two separate conversations here, and I think it's an important distinction to make. So during training, we are asking the coaches to ensure that the face-to-face time is the drills are set up so the face-to-face time is managed and monitored so that it doesn't breach any of those. So we want no drills where the players are going to be face-to-face greater than 3 seconds, and we want you to make sure, as you're thinking about the drills that you're setting up, that you manage the amount of cumulative time so that it is well within the guidelines of 15 minutes. You then have to add on top of that, if you're then going to go into a gameplay situation after that, you then need to think about how that would apply. So if you're going to do a training session and then a 5-set match, then clearly you would have to do even more to minimize that contact time, face-to-face contact time during the training session.
And I think it's also worth adding that the work that we did to analyse the amount of face-to-face contact was to prove our thinking that we could return to volleyball safely. It's not a fixed amount. It's not a guideline that says, right, it's every set is 1 minute. That's broadly what the evidence was showing us. What we'd expect is that clubs and teams do their own risk assessment, and by following the guidance, they are reducing the level of risk to something that is more manageable. But it isn't an absolute fixed, well, as long as you can, it's 1 minute per set, and so therefore as long as you don't do 15 sets you're absolutely fine, and that's within a 48-hour period. So it's much more about do your risk assessments, follow the guidelines, and that reduces the level of risk as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then a bit of practical advice really around people travelling to away matches. So looking forwards, the government advised not using public transport, and some advice really around if you were to share cars or minibuses or a different mode of transport, what would you suggest around that?
Again, so my view on this is that there's lots of kind of practical things out there already that you can talk about, and some of them are going to vary. So for instance, today it's nice and warm. The recommendation would keep your windows open. Clearly in December that's a different conversation. It'll probably be way too cold to keep your windows open. But if you think about what they're doing in taxis today, people are wearing face masks. Again, that reduces the risk. So it's all about what can you do to minimize that risk as you're going through. If I think about it for my team, if I'm traveling, in the past we would have had 5 in a car. We won't do that anymore. We'll look at that and probably have 3 in a car instead of 5. And we'll make the decision whether it's 3 or 4, but we will certainly be looking at that and figuring out what's the risk that we want to take and how we would do that. I've seen in America, for instance, they've decided on for their students travelling that they're saying that it's one per double seat and staggered on either side of the bus. So they're now having to take potentially 2 buses where they were taking 1. But I'm just giving you that as an example. That's not a requirement. You have to go back to the government guidelines and make sure that you look at that and then think about what's appropriate for you, for your club and your situation.
And then a question on the clarification of face-to-face distance, about whether that's 1 metre or 2 metre.
So I love Chris Whitty's conversation around this. He was very clear. It's 1 metre plus mitigation. Okay, so which is the equivalent of 2 meters. So if you're at 1 meter and you have a mask, that's your mitigation that makes it equivalent to 2 meters. If you're at 1 meter and you're side to side fleetingly, that's your 2 meter equivalent. If you're even face to face and it's less than 3 seconds, then that's your mitigation. So it's not about it's never about the meter. It's about the meter plus whatever mitigation that you have.
Thank you. I think we've probably got a couple more to finish off. So first of all, people that can't take part in competition due to the risks, i.e. not having enough players or their venue not being ready. What happens to people that can't take part in competitions such as the National Volleyball League?
So I think I guess I'm interpreting this question a little bit. So one of the things that we are currently looking at, and we need to recognise it's a big step for us, is we're looking at the concept of teams being able to pause their entry for 1 season. So the concept here is, to cover the extreme example. It's not meant for everybody to say, oh, that's fine, we'll take a season off. It's for the very extreme example, maybe a university where they're very dependent on foreign players, and those foreign players are not now travelling, and therefore they don't have the squad that they needed or expected. Or if a venue, if you looked at 4 or 5 other venues and there's literally nowhere you can find to play, then we are looking at and looking to get board approval to allow teams to pause entry for the season. What people need to realise is that what we're saying is that up to 20% of teams in any division can pause. If we go above that, then suddenly the whole kind of process is impractical. We can't have 50% of clubs pausing because A, all of the matches don't work, and B, promotion and relegation then becomes a farce. So we really are thinking about 1 or maybe 2 teams in any division could choose to do that, and that's the thinking about that particular thing.
Great, thank you. And something slightly unrelated but half related is around the AGM. So there's been a question around when that will be and whether it will be virtual.
Yes, I'm happy to take that question, and yeah, hot off the press really, that we're hoping to hold the AGM on the 26th of September, and it will be a virtual AGM. Apologies to everybody that we've had to delay that for all sorts of reasons. We've literally only just got the board to, not got the board have only just decided on that as a date, and the publicity will go out and all the details to everyone beginning of next week. But yeah, hold the date of we can do a save the date now of 26th of September for a virtual AGM.
Okay, I think that finishes the flow of questions that have come in, and hopefully people feel a bit more knowledgeable. As we mentioned, we're here to help. So if you've got further questions, feel free to ask them. We have recorded this webinar, and it will be published through YouTube and shared through our website. And then also the questions and answers, we will aim to try and summarize some of them into a document that can be shared. Is there anything to close, Sue, that you'd like to say?
Yes, please. There was one question came in earlier about the risk scoring point, and Brendan's messaged me because obviously he couldn't present it. He said the question about risk scoring, that's detailed on the first risk assessment slide, which shows 1 to 6 as low, 8 to 10 as medium, and 12 to 25 as high risk. So hopefully that'll answer people's questions on that. If you have any questions or you want any explanation on that, please do get in touch with us, and we can certainly answer any queries that you have around the risk assessment. I suppose just in conclusion, I want to thank everybody who's come along and listened in tonight, and hopefully we've been able to answer your questions and give you some sense of where we're trying to get the sport back. It is challenging times, we absolutely accept that, and ultimately we all just want to get back on court and start playing again, and hopefully with these mitigations in place, that's going to enable that to happen. Thank you very much to all the presenters and to everyone who's put their time in to prepare for this evening's session. And also massive thanks to all the staff and volunteers who've helped us with the return to volleyball working group and getting us to the point that we've got to. I'm still really, really pleased that we were able to move so quickly and ultimately prove that volleyball can be done safely and we're able to mitigate the risks as much as possible. As Rob said earlier, we will try and put together anything we've not answered tonight or any other questions that you've got. We'll try and put together some documents to summarise the questions we've been asked and to answer all of those. But please do keep talking to us. We really want to keep these conversations going and answer anything that anybody has, whether it's email or social media or however you want to get in touch with us, please do, and we'll try and answer everything as best we can. And in the meantime, I just hope everybody has a great time being back on court. Thank you very much for your time, everyone, and have a good evening.